Orange County Registered Digital.
I'd like to thank you all for coming. My name is Tom Berg. I'm a reporter with the Orange County Register. And would like to thank the Orange County Forum for inviting us here today, and would like to thank you for coming. I hope the meal is good. You know, I don't want to give a long list of thank yous, but one person I bumped into before we started, I do want to thank Nancy Dooley. Apparently, this forum's been around for 25 years, and she's been the heart and soul of it for 25 years, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So I'd like to thank you, Nancy. I'm just going to explain one thing here. So I've been a reporter at the Register for 23 years, not quite as long as the OC Forum. And one of the most fascinating assignments I've had came about last month. And we did a week-long series on, it started with the fall of Saigon was 40 years ago. And that gave rise to the rise of Little Saigon and to an amazing journey. After the fall of Saigon, or around the fall of Saigon, approximately 50,000 Vietnamese ended up coming and landing in Camp Pendleton. And they were living in tents down in Camp Pendleton. And they couldn't leave. Well, they lost everything, right? They lost their homes. A lot had lost families. They're in a new land where they really couldn't speak the language very well. They were living in tents, and they couldn't leave until someone sponsored them. And it's amazing when you think that 40 years later, what's happened. You know, we might not see it. It's like you can't see the forest for the trees. But in 4 decades, this group of refugees has created the largest enclave of Vietnamese outside of the nation of Vietnam and the Vietnamese Cultural Center of the United States. And so we want to talk a little bit about how did they do that and what is all around us today. So we have an amazing panel here that I'm going to let introduce themselves. And they're all professors, 2 at Cal State Fullerton, 1 at UCI. And they're going to tell us how this happened today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you 3, and I'll let you introduce yourselves, please.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here today. I really appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this wonderful panel, and particularly to Cal State Fullerton for inviting me to be a part of this panel. My name is Tu-Uyen Nguyen. I am an associate professor in Asian American Studies at Cal State Fullerton, and I've been teaching there since 2007, and so going on 8 years, and I'm just really happy to be here today.
Thank you.
Thanks. I too am very excited to join this conversation and this distinguished panel. I'm also a professor at Cal State Fullerton. I'm a historian who's broadly interested in questions of immigration and multiracial relations, but have recently been working with this really kind of intriguing Vietnamese population. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thuy Vo Dang, and I am actually not a professor. I'm the archivist for the Southeast Asian Archive in Regional History. I'm currently heading the new Orange County and Southeast Asian Archive Center at the UC Irvine Libraries, and I want to give a quick shout out to my UC Irvine colleagues at that table. Zot, zot.
Okay, thank you. So there we go. I'm going to start off by running a few numbers for you. Just to put things in perspective. I might need to put my glasses on for this. Okay, we have 1.8 million Vietnamese Americans in the United States. And of that 1.8 million, 600,000 live in California, which is the most of any state in the United States. And of that, 280,000 live within 50 miles of where we sit right now, and that's the biggest region within the United States. And of that, we have 190,000 that live in Orange County, and that's more than any county in the United States. There's 48,000 Vietnamese Americans in Garden Grove. That's more than any city in Orange County. And we have 38,000 in Westminster, which is 42%, and that's the highest concentration of any city in the United States. So we have, I shouldn't say we, but the Vietnamese Americans have created the largest enclave of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. So I'm going to start it off. I want to get a little personal here, and then we'll make it a little bit more factual. But I want to turn to each of our panelists and just say you had a friend show up in town, and they say, I've heard all about this Little Saigon. Can you take me there? Where would you take them? And talk a little bit about why.
Well, I would definitely take them to the Asian Garden Mall. That is well known in the Orange County and all over the world, actually, as being sort of this cultural center of Little Saigon. And that's definitely one place I would take them. I would also...
Would you pose for a picture there with the Buddha in front?
In front of the statues in the front. But there are so many other places in Little Saigon. I think I can't name any particular restaurant because I don't want to leave others out, but I think there's so many wonderful places to eat. I would also take them to the monument next to the Westminster Civic Center, because I think that's something that was very representative of the collaboration between many different community organizations to try to get this monument of two soldiers, American and Vietnamese, to be represented of the war there. So those are two main places.
That's nice. Yeah. Allison?
And Tom, I'm going to answer your question by not answering your question. And I think that what is so kind of special about Little Saigon is the collection of businesses and kind of the people that make that community. So it's hard to single out any one place despite these kind of special places. So I think I would just walk them all over till they were exhausted.
You know, I have a confession to make, Allison. The reason why I asked the question is because my brother and his wife are coming to town next week. I really wanted some suggestions. Okay.
Well, then I can pick up. If they're coming in June, then I recommend going to the night market outside of the Asian Garden Mall, and you will get
this is new, right?
A whole slew of different kinds of food at the food booths and get in there shopping as well. But I'm going to probably make a very un-PC answer to your question by actually directing people to one of my favorite restaurants. And it's a little unorthodox because it's actually off-strip. So Little Saigon, you know, is concentrated, at least its main corridor is along Bolsa Avenue in Westminster, but the presence of the Vietnamese American community via our businesses and our medical offices and all of our resources extend outwards into Fountain Valley and into Garden Grove. And so I would actually send them to the Korean district where there's a fantastic pho shop. It's actually a pho restaurant called Pho 45, and it was one of my favorites, and we go there almost every Saturday. So.
I think that was on our food critics list as well, I believe. I remember seeing that. Okay, well, you know, Allison, you bring up a great point. You know, Little Saigon, someone described it to me as having invisible boundaries. And I think it's one of these words that's ambiguous that a lot of people use, and they don't always mean the same thing by it. So maybe you could all talk a little bit about what is Little Saigon and how would you define it?
I think one thing I might comment on is the way that it is, despite the ambitions, I think, of the US government in the 1970s as it's resettling these Vietnamese refugees, the idea was to spread them out, to minimize their impact, and that this would hasten their assimilation or integration. And yet, Vietnamese refugees said, no, we want to live where we want to live. So there's a really interesting pattern of secondary migration. So Vietnamese are moving to Orange County and creating this community that wasn't supposed to be. And I think that that's kind of remarkable in that they kind of ran against those policies.
And I would actually add to that, you know, we know that the emergence of Little Saigon, at least on a very formal level, and its official recognition happened in the 1980s. But as early as 1975, we have an article by our UC Irvine campus newspaper, the New U, or the New University, in May of 1975, as that first wave, or the first cohort of evacuees that had come from Southeast Asia, were at Camp Pendleton. A journalist, a student reporter, and a photographer came down from UC Irvine, and they wrote this nice article about how if you ask, you know, a spectator, or you asked your ordinary American where to find Little Saigon off the 5 freeway, they would say that you were smoking something, right? But in fact, that was the unofficial nickname given to areas in Camp Pendleton where Vietnamese were, you know, already starting to establish the social networks that they would need and would rely on to build their communities thereafter.
Yeah, and I think also the history of how Little Saigon came about as a formal term that was designated for this community is really fascinating. There was a lot of advocacy from the community to get this sign put on the freeway, the 22 freeway, if you go into Little Saigon, right? Next exit, Little Saigon. And it was the former governor of California, Du Majan, that officially designated this area. But I think there's a lot of history behind how this community came to this particular area, and Thuy mentioned Camp Pendleton. There were actually 4 different camps set up in the US when the first refugees came over. One was in Camp Pendleton in California, San Diego. One was in Florida at Fort Eglin Air Force Base. Another was in Arkansas, Fort Chaffee. And the 4th was actually in Pennsylvania at Fort Indiantown Gap. And so the idea behind this was to disperse the refugees so that there wouldn't be any ethnic ghettos formed in any particular area of the country, and to reduce the burden, right, on any particular areas. But like Allison was saying, this secondary migration occurred because, well, California, you have great weather, right? Who doesn't want to be in California? And job opportunities. I think that was another area that really attracted a lot of refugees to this area. And so we had this development of Little Saigon as a result.
Yeah, I found that interesting that like you were talking about the second migration. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe is it the culture in the family and the community culture as it was described to me as, whereby refugees that were resettled in these other places, in Florida and Pennsylvania and Arkansas, they ended up getting on buses and coming here. Why was that again?
I think there's different reasons. I should say this because I'm from Pennsylvania, and I didn't take a bus, but I got my way here too.
You did the same thing.
Okay, there we go. So in some ways, there's kind of a universal theme, right, of finding your way to places of opportunity and weather that's more familiar. I think this gets back to your point about finding the great restaurant in kind of this Korean strip mall, is there was an infrastructure, kind of an Asian infrastructure of kind of businesses and landowners that created some support, I think, for these Vietnamese refugees as well.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And actually, also add to that in 1975, 75% of the refugees who were resettled from Camp Pendleton were through faith-based organizations. So, right, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. So in Orange County, we have a very strong tradition of faith-based organizations and mutual assistance agencies. And so that was a huge draw as well in those early years. So the 75ers were also the ones with the cultural and social capital, those who had connections to the U.S. military or to U.S. companies. And so, you know, we're the intelligentsia of the community, and then could really establish the roots for those communities to form.
So we've been talking about 1975 a lot. Not everyone here may know the full story of the immigration of Vietnamese to the United States. Can you lay out for us these different waves? And maybe even the interaction of the waves which contribute to the success of Little Saigon. So someone can jump in here, but you know, in 75 we had, I believe, about 125 to 150,000 immigrants. And then what happens later, and how does that foster the growth of Little Saigon?
I can take that question. I teach Vietnamese communities in the U.S. at Cal State Fullerton, so a lot of, depending on who you ask, I think a lot of people will organize the waves into usually three main waves. Those who left right after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, like Thuy said, were more well-established, had connections to the American government, and so they were able to get out earlier. And then the boat people, or the refugees that we often see represented in the media, those left in 1977 towards the early 1980s. And those refugees didn't have as many resources or connections. Some of them were put into re-education camps after the communists took over. And so when they were released, they organized these escapes. Many of them also included ethnic-based Chinese living in Vietnam at that time who had the resources, fishing boats. A lot of these boat people left on fishing boats, and they were able to get out and escape as a result of that. You also had to have money. You had to pay for these boat trips. Not anyone could escape. And so oftentimes you see families splitting up. They would perhaps send the father or the oldest child to go first with the hopes that they would reach a third country and sponsor the rest of the family over. But we know that they estimate anywhere from 1 to 2 million people escaped by boat, and perhaps 50% of those people died on the high seas. And so it was a very treacherous journey, but many people took that risk because they didn't see any other way out. And then there's the third wave of refugees who came over as a result of family reunification policies that were set up in the early 1980s and going on into the 90s and even today, 2000s. And so,
is there still much immigration today from Vietnam?
I would say so. A lot of it is through family reunification, a lot of families being sponsored over. But yeah, there's...
I just read a statistic about something like 25,000 a year from Vietnam.
25,000 a year?
Yeah.
Okay. There's two topics I want to go to from here. One is the engine of Little Saigon and how these future waves built Saigon, and then the other is some of the trauma that these methods of leaving Vietnam caused. But let's start with, we were talking a little bit about Little Saigon, so let's stick with that for a minute. How did these future waves really, I mean, in my reading of it, they really contributed to the success of Little Saigon. As it was explained to me, the first wave, and I think you were saying that these people were a little bit better off. They had more of a command of the English language, a little bit more education, more connections with the U.S. They were able to start businesses. So when these future waves come over, and some of them were poorer, fishermen, farmers, less language skills, fewer language skills and job skills, they wanted the comfort of a place where they could go, people would speak the language, they might be able to get a job. And there's a momentum that builds off each other, as like a symbiosis here. Can you describe a little bit of that and how that really builds Little Saigon? I mean, there are Little Saigons all over the country, but there are none as big or as old as the one in Orange County. So explain how that worked a little bit, please.
Sure, I'll take it first and then kind of pass it along. And I think part of it is, and I'm stressing the ways in which there are kind of particular but also kind of universal themes in this history, and that is that these are kind of refugees who are, and we'll talk about the trauma, who are not expecting that they'll be able to return, right? And I think that that creates a sense of place and the necessity of kind of belonging and building community that kind of translates into the success of Little Saigon.
And I would add on to that a much longer history of displacement that Vietnamese had experienced even prior to entering the United States. In 1954, when Vietnam was partitioned at the 17th parallel, about 1 million North Vietnamese came down south. So they came down to South Vietnam. Many of them were Catholic, many of them would be persecuted by the communist regime. So the history of displacement is quite embedded in the community. And then of course, in the refugee waves, those who left and made it here were the successful ones, right? So it's almost like this kind of parsing out of the folks who were able to make the journey in the first place, had the resources, the money, the connections, and then actually arrive here. And so in that way, I think all of that contributes to building the infrastructure for a successful Little Saigon community.
Yeah, I would agree. And historically, right, we also, if you go back 10 years before the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, in 1965, there was the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which totally changed the immigration history for many groups, European immigrants as well as immigrants from Asia. And this program basically set up a system for certain refugees and certain immigrants to be accepted into the US. And a lot of it was based on occupational categories. If you had certain skills, right, that the US was looking for at that time. This was during the Civil Rights Movement. And we wanted to be portrayed to the rest of the world that we're the land of the free. And so President Kennedy and then later on President Johnson signed this act into law because we wanted to accept, right, immigrants into the country. And later on in the 1970s and 80s, much of that act facilitated a lot of family reunifications. And so if you were the spouse of a citizen, if you were children, it had certain mechanisms in place for these people to come over. And so I think the refugees, as a result of the Vietnam War, benefited greatly from these policies that were already in place. And when the first refugees came over in 1980, the Refugee Act actually set up parameters to get refugees on their feet. And so they had 36 months of welfare, for example, right? And they were able to make it because they had a lot of support. They had sponsors that were able to take them in and basically provide for them food, shelter, right? All these mechanisms that were in place because of these policies.
So you're saying that there's several factors here. We have some programs in place to help. We have this history of dealing with change, and we have Little Saigon set up. Is it fair to say that this wave of immigrants to America, have they assimilated faster than past waves? How do they compare, say, to past waves that we think of in America? How are they similar and how are they different? And is it quicker, or is that just our imagination because the world runs quicker?
Yeah, that's hard to measure, right? Because the world is different, and this is a community that did have certain kind of resources, had a distinctive history of displacement, but they definitely relied upon those kind of ethnic and cultural ties, and I think that that has been a long-standing tradition in U.S. history, whether you're looking at Irish, Mexican, or Italian immigrants. I think kind of Vietnamese, like Mexican immigrants, and I connect those because the immigration is continuous. And if you think about some of those earlier groups where you have a wave and then that wave is interrupted by immigration restriction, right? And that kind of cuts off. But here you see kind of the renewal and the replenishment, I think, of Vietnamese culture and maybe some of those kind of generational kind of tensions as well as commonalities.
Any other thoughts here?
I would definitely agree with that, and the only thing I would add is just in thinking about the variations, or in comparing and contrasting to other immigrant groups, the refugee narrative is actually what is so vital to this community's sense of identity and its placemaking. So I think that that's the way in which Vietnamese have been compared to Cuban refugees in Miami, right? As this stronghold that's been able to solidify a lot of political power in a relatively short amount of time because of something that glues them together, right? And to me, I think that refugee identity is a very strong kind of a glue. It's a super glue, right? It's, this is, and it'll be tied into hopefully our later discussion about trauma and how that continues to impact the community.
Well, let's talk about that, yeah. Someone described it to me that trauma is part of the narrative of this wave of immigrants from Vietnam. Is that the case? And if so, what does that mean?
I think trauma is something that is definitely a part of this refugee experience. And I come from a public health background. My PhD is in public health from UCLA, and I gravitated towards studying mental health issues in the refugee community. And if you look at not only the Vietnamese, but also there are Cambodian, Lao, Hmong refugees who were affected by this war. We have the largest Cambodian community in Long Beach, right? Outside of Cambodia here. There's many numbers of Lao in Fresno, Minnesota, for example. The Hmong population in Minnesota is one of the highest anywhere. And so you have these very unique communities that have formed throughout the US, and for many of them, what ties them together is this sense of trauma, right? That they experience not only during the war and before the war, but after the war, right? Having gone through all of that and having gone through all that loss, to come here to America and basically trying to deal with that trauma, some of them not having the resource to be able to do that. And so you have things like the protest in Little Saigon, where you had mentioned the video store owner who hung up a picture of Ho Chi Minh, and it sparked, right, 53 days of protest in Little Saigon. And it's when you look at that from the outside, you think, oh my gosh, how can someone protest for 53 days over something that may seem inconsequential, right?
And what's the answer?
But I think that it goes back to that issue of trauma, and people are trying to deal with this in a very big community-wide way of storytelling, right? It was an opportunity for a lot of people to say, when the fall of Saigon happened, right, it's not just about down with the communists and this anti-communism fervor, but it's about like you said, my uncle died in the re-education camp, or my mom lost her life at, on the high seas. There's all these stories that
that comes out as Down with Communism.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You can really feel it that way.
Yeah.
It's not an abstract issue, it's personal.
Right.
Does that create an issue with the generations? Where the first generation came, they witnessed the horror. They lost family members. They lost their homes. They lost everything. The kids, they don't relate to it. It's what I think of it as is, like, I interviewed a lot of World War II veterans over the years, in men and women who were at Pearl Harbor. They say, we can never forget. They lived it. They saw it. And like with me, I get it on a cerebral level, but I don't feel it the way they do. And I think there's a similar thing going on with the parents that came here and saw the horrors of war, and saw the horrors of trying to get here, and the kids who live a pretty good life now. How does that generational split, how does the new, well, maybe you could start off by telling us, what is a 1.5 generation? Because I heard that term a lot. I don't know what it means. And what is the second generation? Where are we at? And how does the new generation see life different from the first generation?
That's quite a loaded question, but let me try to pick it apart in pieces. So the generation, what's 1.5, what's first? Obviously, the first generation are those who came here, experienced the war firsthand. Well, we're talking about Vietnamese Americans specifically, right? And they've had to come here and adapt and remake their lives. Their children, they might be anywhere. And the 1.5 is this really kind of ambiguous category. Some people define it as those who were teenagers when they got here, but others, like myself, who came when I was 5 years old, also identify as 1.5 because of my retention of the language and the affiliations that I have with the community's history and memory. And the second generation are American-born. So they're Vietnamese who are born in the United States, born and raised here. And what we're seeing is an emerging third generation now. So that's kind of where we're at. And that really ties into many other communities' histories. For instance, the Jewish community, the Holocaust survivors, the Japanese community, internees who have those memories. It takes about 30 to 40 years before these memories can really surface and be a point of conversation in families. And so what we're seeing as our community, Vietnamese Americans, at that very pivotal moment, when so many who are the first-hand witnesses, those who experienced the wars, those who experienced the displacements from the wars, they are now at a point where they're passing away, and their children are trying to make sense of that. And there's a lot of, there's a scholar who talks about post-memory, when she talks about the way it reverberates in the second generation. Those who, like myself, I was born well after the war. Not well after, shortly after the war had ended. That's me trying to fool myself. But I was born after the war ended, so I have no real tangible connection or memories to that war, but my father was a South Vietnamese soldier. And these are not stories that are shared directly in a lot of Vietnamese American homes, because if you think about it logically, right, the space of the home, it's incompatible with these stories. So when would you ever talk about experiences of seeing your comrade in arms shot, or your uncle, drowning at sea, your sister? And so these are stories that we're now collecting. Actually, since 2011, UC Irvine has the Vietnamese American Oral History Project. I was the first project director, and it's still going on. We have over 300 full oral histories of Vietnamese Americans in Southern California. And you can access that database via our UCI Libraries site that we built. So you can hear right now over 160 stories. And these are stories of perseverance and resilience and survival.
More trauma. I mean, how do they reconcile that? Like, if you went through the horrors of war or the horrors of a boat person experience, and your child just sees it as this abstract thing, like a history book, some of the things that I've heard is that some of the parents want the children to take Vietnamese language classes so they can retain the culture. And there's also, at least in the past, been great debate about whether it's okay to return to Vietnam or not too. But what are the ways in which these families reconcile these huge differences in outlook on life?
Yeah, I would think that there's no single strategy or single response. I mean, in some ways, I think parents might read their children's separation from that trauma as a sign of their success, of their Americanization, right? That they have kind of protected them. I think others might kind of resent the loss of that culture, that heritage, that memory. And I think when you talked about kind of Japanese Americans, I think there's also this opportunity for the latest generation to step up and talk on their kind of, you know, grandparents' behalf or their parents' behalf because they have that distance, right? So I think there's those choices.
On the topic, I know some of you specialize in some issues of trauma, and there was the Amerasian, which is a very unique situation. Where, tell us a little bit about that, Allison, and the rest can weigh in on some of these issues.
Sure,
with children, unaccompanied children coming to the United States.
Right, absolutely. And I was thinking of kind of current, very heated debates about what Americans' obligations are to children who are crossing the U.S.-Mexican border, mostly originating from Central America. And part of my work has looked at children who were adopted by American families or children who were sent by their Vietnamese families with the hopes that they might reunite in the United States if they were lucky enough to get out on one of those later waves. A lot of these children did have American fathers or suspect they have American fathers, and the United States did try to make amends in its words and assume responsibility through the Amerasian Homecoming Act passed in 1987 that kind of hurried some of this family reconciliation. And there was kind of trauma and loss, but also cases of reconciliation and reunion that they kind of balance out the story.
I think we're also, as a country, as a nation, we're trying to reconcile with this history still, right? There's an exhibit right now that's going on up in San Francisco at the Presidio on Operation Baby Lift, and it opened on April 17th, and it'll be going on until December 31st. But so out of the, in 1975, there was an Operation Baby Lift, which took about 2,000 children from Vietnam into the United States, and about 1,500 of them passed through the Presidio, and that's from there they were kind of sent out to be sponsored or adopted by American families. So that exhibit is going, and it's trying to really kind of, I think a lot of these ways in which we try to reconcile with the past is trying to figure out, at least, I mean, as I've observed in the Vietnamese community, asking a really crucial question, which is, what are the memories that we can live with? And then how do we move on from those memories, right, as traumatic as they may be? And so, talking about it, dialoguing, exhibiting these stories, sharing these stories so that those that live around us, our neighbors, our friends, people we work with, can also understand some of these histories as well.
I'm going to show my rookie status as a moderator here by declaring that I don't have a watch. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? Thank you. We have a couple of quick issues we want to move on. Tu-Uyen, did you want to talk a little bit about health issues? I know you specialize in some of that.
Yeah, I think coming from a public health background, I think that a lot of the trauma that refugees experience, it's not easily expressed, obviously, right? And I see now as a professor teaching at the college level, a lot of those children of those refugees coming into my classes, wanting to learn more about their history. And I actually assign an assignment where I have them go and interview someone from their family or in the community to talk about this history, because like Thuy said, it's very hard to broach this subject at the dinner table, right? Mom, what happened? And so I think this gives them an excuse to be able to learn about that history. And as the second, third generation grows up and assimilates into American society, I think there's more of that need for searching for that identity, right? How do you operate in these two cultures, sometimes multi-cultures? And if you go into Little Saigon nowadays, you see Korean restaurants. The people cooking the food in the restaurants are usually Mexican, for example. And so there's a lot of blending of different cultures, and I think there's this need, right, for these up-and-coming generations to learn more about how do we coexist in this society, this multicultural society, this diverse society. And I'm really heartened to see projects like the Vietnamese American Oral History Project, the Southeast Asian Archives. At Fullerton, we're starting a BA program in Vietnamese studies, and we have Vietnamese language classes, like you were saying. A lot of schools have these programs because there is that need out there. And I think that a part of that need is for different people to learn about each other, right? To learn about how do we coexist in this society? How do we get along? How do we work together to build up our communities? So I think that's part of it.
I think we have time for like maybe two more questions. One, I'd like to just touch briefly on the politics. If you could maybe describe what have the politics been, and what are they becoming, and what is the importance of having, say, a Vietnamese American on the city council or on the board of supervisors? Like, what is the importance of it, and where is it at today?
I have a real quick answer to that, which is
That's what we like, real quick.
I think it's fantastic to see Vietnamese American political leaders, and we've really seen, over a dozen currently political leaders in this county alone. But I think it's less important that they are Vietnamese American and more important that they understand Vietnamese American issues, the community, its history. So that to me is a lot more important, and there are certainly resources that you can seek to understand those histories.
Yeah, and I would just say, anti-communism has been the conventional political language that kind of Vietnamese refugees have spoken to get heard and because of their experience, but I think because of generational change, I think there's newer vocabularies that are being embraced.
Yeah, related to that, I mean, my research before I came to the archive was I got my doctorate at UC San Diego in ethnic studies, and I wrote a dissertation on anti-communism as a cultural politics. And the way that I came to understand it is, and I'm really adopting a political scientist named John Harles, who looks at Laotian refugees, and he comes up with this really nice term to describe what he sees as a politics of the lifeboat, which is one that's about refugees who arrive at this country already embedded in this narrative of indebtedness, right? That needing to demonstrate that we belong and are worthy of being here and being citizens of this country. And that politics really circumscribes what we're able to say about ourselves in the public sphere. So anti-communism has been that engine and that vehicle in the past 40 years for Vietnamese Americans to be heard. I read it as an opportunity to really share stories, right? And really, to me, it comes down to a question of history and memory. Where are the spaces that we can write our stories, and how do we seize the tools to write those histories? And anti-communism has been quite a divisive way to do that. And I would love for us to look for ways to expand beyond that, think about different ways of engaging our history, and being more inclusive of Vietnamese American, because we see the waves, newer arrivals from Vietnam who have a very different historical reality, right? Having been educated in Vietnam, where the refugee history is not taught at all, and that's problematic too, and we can certainly rectify it by teaching it here to them. Right, they're a part of our community too, and we also have to reconcile with these boundaries that we've set up around Vietnamese America.
Thank you. I'm seeing some movement here by a friend of mine, Eddie. Does this mean, Eddie, that our time here is being turned over to you?
It does, in fact. If we can wrap it up, and then we'll start the Q&A session.
Okay, one more question, or?
Last one, go for it.
Okay, what's that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's just look forward a little bit. Maybe each of you could sum up what has the Vietnamese American community, what have they accomplished in these 40 years? And when we look 5 years down the road, where is it going?
Oh, big question.
And you have approximately 30 seconds to answer it.
We've transformed cuisine in this county in amazing ways. There we go. That's it?
Okay. Eddie, it might be time to throw it over to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause, please, for the... I don't know if this mic works or not. Does it sound like it's working? No. Okay, I bet you didn't know this, but we had a 3D presentation up there, right? 3 doctors. So we had the 3 PhDs up there. You know, I really want to thank you, and since we have time, you know, we have a good 15 minutes for Q&A, and usually some of the meat and potatoes comes out in the Q&A. The whole notion of immigration is so complex, right? So I have, you know, my parents were immigrants from Mexico, so I'm a second generation Latino who's very close to our culture. The difference with mine is that there was no trauma with ours. I mean, there was certainly trauma for my parents getting here, being undocumented, but I grew up in very general bliss and peacetime in the US, so it's a lot different experience, and the contributions that the Vietnamese community has been able to do in such a short period of time. Nancy and I were discussing that one of the things we really wanted to hear was about the contributions of the Vietnamese community, and you guys touched on it a little. I wanted to share a quick story. I have one of my son's friends. She's a 19-year-old Vietnamese. She's now, you guys call her second generation, right? Because she's not 1.5, but she's really like third generation, right? Her parents, well, no, you know what? She's a really young, she has an old father. She's a really young second generation. And I was talking with her the other day because, by the way, shameless plug, we have this insert here, how they became us, that the Orange County Register so generously provided today, and you can pick it up on the way out. I was sharing this with her, and she knew nothing about it, right? Now, I think one of the things is she lives in Pomona. So being a Vietnamese person, being an API, being a Latino in Orange County is a lot different from somebody from the Inland Empire. But I was telling her her story, and she was just amazed that I knew so much about the Vietnamese experience. Now, I'm not going to start pointing them out because I know I'll leave somebody out, but I have very good friends in this room who are Vietnamese, and I consider them my brethren. And the interesting thing about that story is that this young lady doesn't even consider herself Vietnamese. I mean, she does, but she's an American. All she's known is growing up in America. She was raised here, she was born here. So for her, she's now an American, and that's what matters to her. So actually, she's fascinated with the fact that there's a great history to her history. But it was interesting because she, for all intents and purposes, she's an American. So all she's ever known is being an American. So that's the whole thing about the diaspora of immigration, right? So anyway, I'm hogging up the mic. Raise your hands for questions, please. I know you've got some burning questions.
Even if they're not burning, we can answer them.
We'll take lukewarm. Anybody? Really? We've got 15 minutes. We've got a question here. All right, Roger. Okay. Okay. When the first influx of immigrants came to Garden Grove, there was a lot of tension. That's a really good question, by the way. There was a lot of tension. How has that been resolved? Has it been resolved? Do the issues linger? What's going on?
I can take that. Well, I have, in the archive, we have some newly acquired materials that actually show a lot of the friction that happened in the 1980s as these businesses were starting to form in Westminster. And I just read a statistic that something like 350 businesses were listed in the Westminster area in 1982 or 83. So, you know, the residents in Westminster were protesting giving out these business licenses to Vietnamese Americans, arguing that they weren't generating the tax revenues, right, that they should have, because a lot of this was a cash economy. I think that over the last 20-something, 30 years, there's been a significant change in terms of receptiveness by the community. And in large part, it's through, at least this is my biased perspective, it's through our education system, right? We have public schools that are now willing to teach Vietnamese American history, dual language immersion in Westminster, and hopefully soon in Garden Grove. College campuses locally that offer Asian American Studies courses that will connect people to help them understand these experiences. So with that comes a change in thinking about these communities, and whether their businesses generate tax is only one aspect of what makes them, you know, contributing members of the society, right? There are other things that they can lend and contribute to the county in terms of teaching us about diversity and teaching us about how to live with difference. Right. So I think that, yeah, so that's, I'll stop there and see if you want to.
Just to kind of reinforce that point and maybe to connect to Eddie's comments about how kind of this younger generation might identify in multiple ways. I don't think the Vietnam War means the same thing to non-Vietnamese, right? Who, because of their kind of distance from that history, because they didn't live through it, and so I think that also kind of shapes how they approach Vietnamese culture and Vietnamese people. So I think that's part of the story too.
And I think stories like that are not necessarily unique to Orange County, right? We had a lot of immigrants going to other places in the US that experienced a lot of discrimination, racism, hardships when they came over because of how they were received. And I think it's sort of this history of immigrants coming to the US, right? Certain immigrants are seen in a certain way when they come over, and it changes over time depending on the communities that are set up. And I think what's wonderful about Little Saigon and Orange County is that there are these opportunities through food, right? You have people coming to Little Saigon to experience the food because it's so wonderful, and then they want to learn more about that history. And so I think it's a great point of entry to be able to learn about different cultures. Right?
Actually, thank you very much, Eddie. Before the supervisor leaves, a great contribution to the county. He had some comments he wanted to make.
Not comments so much. Can you hear me? I can't hear you from back here. I was going to leave to go to my vector control meeting, but but because I actually grew up in Garden Grove and lived there since the middle of 1976, and I was part of that second migration coming from Alabama. So I fit into all of the things that you talked about. So I wanted to share a little bit of my observation, and this is anecdotal. And there's so much that you covered, and you're right on, but I just wanted to share to what I have seen. When you talk about it originally about the trauma and why people wanted to come together and form a community, a part of it was survival for their families. Because, mind you, this is 75, 76 to the early 80s. If you had family members back in Vietnam, and if you belonged to the old government at all, your families were blacklisted. That means they couldn't go to school, they couldn't get a job. And so they actually live off of what we remit from the US. And so a large part of the formation of the Little Saigon Business District was really, there were two places, two businesses. One was a grocery store where you could actually buy Vietnamese food. And then one was a pharmacy where they specialized in buying things that were in demand in Vietnam. Cloth, rice cookers, radios, things that they could, medicine, that they could buy, receive in Vietnam and sell in order to get money to live on. And so that was the kind of genesis of what now turned out to be Bolsa. Little Saigon was that. It was that just that little corner. And then over time, people came from San Diego, from Los Angeles to go there so they could send these things. And it was convenient. Other than that location, you couldn't go anywhere else. There was no place else that had the capability and the know-how to send stuff back to Vietnam. Okay, and also it required that the business owner, not that they were so smart, they had connection that could bypass the communist government over there that would allow them to bypass, customs and all that. So it's the business connection that allows you to then send stuff to Vietnam. And so if you talk about the genesis of that business district is there, and then a bigger, more universal issue about anti-communism. In terms of age, I should be a first generationer, but in terms of attitude, I'm more of the 1.5. I grew up in Alabama. I went to school, to college at UC Davis. Wasn't really part of the Vietnamese American community that much. But the one thing that I learned, having been involved for the last 10 years in politics, is a lot of time people look at anti-communism, I think in sometimes overly simplistic terms. It is an easily identifiable label to describe a state of mind. What is that state of mind? That state of mind is to fight for equal rights, for human rights, for democracy, for value in Vietnam. So it's more of a state of mind of a statement of political belief. And we're not just fighting for just a political belief, we're fighting for the people over there who are still family members, right? Who are still suffering. Because right now, over there, you really don't have rights. If you own land and the government wants to take over eminent domain, basically, so they can develop their business, their industry, they'll take it over. You see, it's that kind of displacement that is happening throughout Vietnam that we are fighting for over here. So it's really not just communism per se, because there is no communism in Vietnam. You know, it's all oligarchy over there. It's really a bunch of families, you know, controlling the whole country for their own financial benefits. It's not socialism. We know that. So it's not a political system that we are necessarily fighting against, but it's more of a set of values to protect the people that we, you know, our family members in Vietnam. And there's way more, but I want to just say that before I leave because I didn't want to.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. Thank you.
Can I actually address, thank you, Supervisor Doan.
He's got to go to his vector control meeting, his vector.
Yeah, important stuff. But I do want to address his second point about the, you know, that early business development and the pharmacy, Nguyens Pharmacy, that was one of the first businesses. So and here's shameless plug number one. My book, which I co-authored with Linda Vo and Tram Lee, it's called Vietnamese in Orange County, and it was recently published by Arcadia Publishing in March. There's a chapter on the creation of Little Saigon, and it's told through a visual history. We actually cover Nguyens Pharmacy quite a bit, and his oral history is part of the VAOHP archive. You know, what we found was, interestingly, these care packages that the families were coming to a pharmacy. You'd think, you know, the traditional role of a pharmacy is to go get medicine, but in fact they were coming there to, as Supervisor Doe said, assemble care packages. But instead of being routed directly to Vietnam, it would have to go through France because we had an economic embargo on Vietnam until 1995, right? So there was a way in which, you know, through all of these very transnational networks, Vietnamese were working together across the globe, I would say, to facilitate care and commitment to the homeland. And that ties into his last comment about anti-communism. It is a very complex set of cultural, I think, not just the politics, but it's part of the cultural consciousness of what it means to be Vietnamese American. And it definitely deserves some more pondering and discussion than the way that I think it tends to get dismissed in our popular imagination.
Thank you. All right, we have one more question and then we're going to wrap it up.
Where do you each see the history, not the history, but the future of Little Saigon going, both with the physical constraints of where it is and with going on to second and third generations who don't have that tie? They have the family tie, but not the tie for the reason of being there in the first place.
I mean, I would say, just speaking from the history of immigration generally, all these kind of ethnic enclaves, communities are always dynamic and always changing. And there has been kind of a pattern of those outside that particular ethnic group kind of coming in. And then you find new locations for kind of community. And you might return to that center and try to kind of restore and preserve. But I would predict change as much as continuity.
Yeah, I would agree. And I actually brought this report that we recently came out last year. It's called A Community of Contrast, that was put out by Advancing Justice and the Orange County Asian Pacific Islander Community Alliance. And it's a great report on the changing demographics of the Orange County Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And it's really interesting. For example, Irvine has the highest Asian population in Orange County at this point. And you see, you know, centers like the Jamboree Diamond Center being developed. There's so much change going on in so many areas of Orange County. But I think, again, the constant here, right, is that change will continue to happen. And I think even if you have families moving out of the area, you still have the second, third generation coming back because there's so many businesses, right? Over 2,000 businesses in Little Saigon itself that provide so many services beyond the terrific food. There's so many services that are provided in that area that are needed by not just Vietnamese Americans, but so many others in the county.
And
All right, we have one last question, folks. Okay. First, nobody wanted to ask questions. Now everyone's got a question.
Well, I'm not going to ask a question, but I want to make a comment. You guys did a really good job covering all the history because I'm Vietnamese American, and I was born in Vietnam. I was 7 years old, and My dad was an American soldier who died during the war, who I never met. So you cover the immigration, which I am, and also the baby airlift. My family gave me up for adoption, but thank God they came and got me like 2 days before the flight that came out that crashed, that killed a lot of people on there. So growing up, you know, and then you hit, for my journey, it was pretty incredible too, because I was at the airport, you know, on the 29th, the fall of Vietnam was the 30th, and we were stuck at the airport, the bombing around us. And so helicopters came in and picked up our family. And we were one of the 3,073 refugees that landed on the USS Midway, which the register was there for the commemoration in San Diego. And so our journey, you know, sitting here, I just think about, you know, I remember those things, and you know, it's different now with children. Now they don't see the history like we do. But for our family, you know, our journey was from the USS Midway to Philippines to Guam, and then to El Centro. I was in El Centro. And then we were blessed to be sponsored by Grace Lutheran Church. You talked about religion, and we were sponsored to this beautiful city, El Centro. Just kidding. But, you know, it was freedom. I mean, we were free. And that's all that mattered. You know, we were forced out of our country. We left our friends, families. And so we're blessed to move here in '79. I've been here since Orange County. In '79 since in Orange County. And so being elected Vietnamese American, I'm really honored with that, to be with Andrew and our new Senator Janet Nguyen and all the other elected council men and women, you know, and just to be in this great country and to accomplish something as a 7-year-old, coming here with nothing, literally nothing. So I just want to make a comment. Thanks for inviting me on. This was great. Thank you, guys.
Well, that's a great way to end it.
Orange County Register. We are here in the service of Orange County.